She set that folder down on my kitchen table like she was closing a business deal. No raised voice, no apology, not even a moment of hesitation. Just Meredith, my son Daniel's wife, standing in the kitchen I had painted with my own hands on a Tuesday morning in late October, telling me with a calm that I still haven't been able to fully explain to people that the family had decided I should leave my home. Not eventually. Not when I got too old to manage the stairs. Now. And here's the thing that I don't think most people understand when I tell this story. I had already packed one suitcase before she finished her second sentence. It was sitting right there at the base of the staircase in the hallway, already zipped. She could see it from where she was standing, and for one brief second I watched her expression shift. She assumed it meant she had already won. She was wrong about that. But I let her keep assuming it, because at that exact moment, standing in my own kitchen at 71 years old, I finally understood something I had been turning over in my mind for months without being able to name it clearly. She hadn't found it yet. And until she did, the most powerful thing I could possibly do was nothing at all. My name is Walter Hargrove. I spent 31 years as a municipal surveyor for the city of Portland, Maine. If you don't know what a surveyor does, the simplest way I can explain it is this. My job was to determine, with absolute legal and mathematical precision, where one person's property ended and another person's began. I spent my career reading land, reading documents, reading people who were absolutely certain they were right, and finding, sometimes very gently and sometimes not so gently, the exact place where their certainty stopped matching the truth. I retired at 64. I have been living alone at 418 Willamere Lane since my wife, Elaine, passed 7 years ago. The house is a 2-story colonial white clapboard with dark green shutters on a quiet stretch of road about 1.5 miles from the water. I bought it in 1996, the year Daniel turned 20. I made every payment myself. I fixed the porch myself. I replaced the roof, twice, with contractors I chose and paid and supervised. I know every corner of that house the way a surveyor knows a property line, not just from memory, but from years of careful attention. That house was not inherited wealth. It was not a lucky investment. It was 3 decades of deliberate, unglamorous work, one payment at a time on a government salary. I say that not because I want sympathy. I say it because it matters to the story, and because what Meredith told me on that October morning only makes sense if you understand what that house actually represented to the person who was being asked to leave it. Let me go back a little, because if I start with Meredith in that folder, you'll miss the part that explains why I was ready. About 14 months before that Tuesday morning, Daniel came to the house for dinner. Just the two of us, which was unusual enough that I noticed. He usually brought Meredith. They'd been married 18 years by that point, and she had a way of filling any room she walked into, organizing conversations the way she organized everything else in her life, by agenda. But that night, it was just Daniel. He arrived around 6, and we ate at the kitchen table, leftover pot roast I'd made the day before, which he always liked. And somewhere around the second helping, he asked me a question that I remember thinking, at the time, was just curiosity. He asked me whether I had ever considered what I wanted to happen to the house after I was gone. I told him I had a plan. He asked if it was written down. I said it was handled. He nodded and changed the subject, and we talked about his work and the drive up from Boston and the weather, and by the time he left, I had almost forgotten the question entirely. Almost. Because Daniel was not the kind of man who asked questions without a reason. He's an organized person. Thorough. Gets that from his mother, honestly. And the way he'd phrased it, after I was gone, had a specific weight to it that I'd noticed but decided not to examine too closely. Then, around 4 months after that dinner, something else happened. My neighbor, Bev Colton, she's lived on Willamere Lane for as long as I have, a retired school teacher, 73, sharp as any person I've ever met. She mentioned to me over the back fence one Saturday afternoon that she'd seen a man she didn't recognize walking slowly around the perimeter of my property. She described him as somewhere in his 40s, carrying a clipboard, moving in a way that seemed deliberate rather than casual. She said she'd considered saying something to him but didn't want to cause a scene. She just wanted me to know in case I'd hired someone for work and forgotten to mention it. I had not hired anyone. I didn't say that to Bev right away. I told her it was probably nothing, thanked her, and went back inside. But I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that conversation. A man with a clipboard, walking my property line. After 31 years as a surveyor, that image had a very specific meaning to me. Now, I want to be honest about something, because this story isn't one I'd tell to make myself sound clever. I spent a fair amount of time in those months trying to explain those observations away. The dinner conversation with Daniel. Maybe he was just being responsible, planning ahead. The man with the clipboard, maybe Bev had misidentified him. Maybe he was walking a neighboring lot. Maybe it was nothing at all. I gave those alternative explanations real consideration because I did not want to believe what the other explanation required me to believe. That my son was looking at my property the way someone looks at something they expect to inherit soon. Not out of grief. Not out of love for a father whose health was declining. Out of anticipation. The distinction matters enormously, and I didn't want to arrive at it prematurely, so I made myself slow down. I made myself observe more before I concluded anything. And what I observed over the following months was a pattern of small things, none of which were dramatic, none of which were illegal, none of which I could have pointed to individually and called alarming. But together, laid side by side the way you lay survey markers along a boundary line, they describe something. Daniel started asking differently about the house's maintenance costs. Not concerned, the way someone asks about an aging parent's expenses because they want to help. Specific, the way someone asks about carrying costs when they're calculating what something is going to cost them to hold. A piece of mail arrived at my address that was addressed not to me, but to a company name I didn't recognize. I signed for it without thinking, set it on the counter, looked at it again an hour later. The return address was a title services company in Portland. I set it aside rather than opening it. It wasn't addressed to me, but I wrote the company name down in the small pocket notebook I've carried for 30 years. Then, in late August, about 2 months before Meredith arrived with her folder, I was getting my oil changed at a garage I've used since 1998. The owner, a man named Ray Dobbins, mentioned offhand while we were talking that he'd run into a fella asking around about property assessment timelines for single-owner residential properties. Said the fella had described the neighborhood in a way that sounded like Willowmere Lane without ever naming it directly. Ray had no reason to lie about that. He also had no particular reason to connect it to me, and he didn't. He mentioned it the way people mention odd conversations they've had. But I stood there in that garage with the smell of motor oil and old coffee in the air, and I listened to Ray describe the fella's questions, and by the time I drove home I had enough to do what I should have done 2 months earlier. I picked up the phone and called an attorney. Her name is Patricia Lund. She's a property and estate attorney here in Portland, about 58 years old, been practicing for over 30 years. I had used her once before, back when I was finalizing Elaine's estate, and she had impressed me with her combination of directness and patience. She explained things clearly. She didn't talk down to you. I called her on a Thursday, got an appointment for the following Monday, and spent the weekend going through a wooden box I kept on the high shelf of my bedroom closet. It contained property documents, original deed, tax records going back years, a copy of a legal arrangement I had established with Patricia's help about 4 years earlier, after Elaine passed, and I had done some serious thinking about what I wanted to happen to the things I'd spent a lifetime building. I read through everything carefully that weekend, not because I'd forgotten what the documents said, but because I had learned in 31 years of surveying that there is a significant difference between remembering what something says and actually reading it again after circumstances have changed. The arrangement I had put in place was something called a revocable living trust. Patricia had suggested it 4 years ago as a way to manage the property cleanly, avoid certain legal complications, and maintain my control over the house during my lifetime, while establishing clear instructions for its future. I had thought about it carefully at the time, made my decisions, signed the paperwork, and then done what a lot of people do with important legal arrangements. I'd put it in the box on the shelf and returned to my regular life. What I understood, rereading those documents on that Saturday afternoon with the autumn light coming through the bedroom window, was that the arrangement I had made was more significant than Meredith apparently knew. More significant, it seemed, than Daniel had told her. Because there were things in that document that made the scenario she was likely imagining, walking into my kitchen and telling me the house now belonged to a future that she had decided upon. Not just premature, but legally incorrect in a way that she would not realize until she tried to act on it. I read through everything twice. Then I called Patricia on Monday morning and confirmed the appointment. I'm going to be straight with you here because I think it's the only way this story makes any sense. When I sat down across from Patricia Lund in her office on that Monday, with my wooden box of documents on the table between us, I was not angry. I was not operating from a plan to trap my daughter-in-law or humiliate my son. I was a 71-year-old man who had spent his career dealing with the precise legal reality of where things stood, and I had begun to suspect that the people I trusted most had formed a picture of my future without asking me a single question about what I actually wanted. What I needed to know from Patricia was simple. I needed to know whether my understanding of my own legal situation was accurate. She looked through the documents for about 20 minutes while I sat quietly and looked at the framed survey maps on her office walls. She collected antique ones, which I always appreciated. Then she set the papers down and looked at me over her reading glasses with the kind of expression that tells you someone is choosing their words carefully because they respect you. She said, "Walter, you are in a considerably stronger position than most people in your situation would be. But I want to make sure you understand exactly where that position begins and ends, because there are some things here that could matter significantly depending on how the next few weeks develop." I asked her to explain. She did, and when she finished, I understood 3 things very clearly. First, I had done the right things years earlier for exactly the right reasons, and those decisions were now protecting me in ways I hadn't fully appreciated when I made them. Second, whoever had been advising Daniel and Meredith, because I was now quite certain someone had been advising them, had given them information that was accurate as far as it went, but incomplete in ways that were going to matter enormously. Third, there was one specific step still available to me, one adjustment to the arrangement that Patricia said I still had the authority to make, that I had not yet made, and that if I chose to make it, it would permanently change the landscape of everything that was coming. I sat with that for a few days. I've never been someone who rushes important decisions. I thought about Daniel, about the dinners we'd had, about the years when I was a younger man and he was becoming an adult, and how much of my life I had spent trying to make sure he had options I never had. I thought about Meredith, who I had always found difficult but had never stopped trying to understand. I thought about what it meant that my son had sat at my kitchen table and eaten pot roast with me and asked about the house with questions that sounded like concern but were, I now believed, something else entirely. I thought about all of it. And then, about 3 weeks before Meredith arrived with her folder, I went back to Patricia Lund's office and told her what I had decided. She nodded. We signed the papers. I took my copies, put them in the wooden box, and drove home to Willowmere Lane. That evening I stood in my kitchen for a while, looking at the room. The wallpaper Elaine and I had chosen together. The window above the sink that shows the old oak in the backyard. The shelf where I keep the brass compass my father gave me, which has sat in the same spot for so long that I genuinely believe the house would feel different without it. I felt something settle inside me that evening. Not relief, exactly. More like the particular stillness that comes after you've finally done something you should have done a long time ago. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in late October, I heard a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. I looked out the window. It was Daniel's car. He was in the passenger seat. Meredith was driving, and that was the morning the suitcase came out of the closet. Not because I had given up, but because I had already understood something they hadn't even begun to look for yet. I carried it to the base of the stairs, set it down, and went to put the kettle on. I was ready. Whether they were or not was a different question entirely. When Meredith sat down across from me at that table and opened that folder, the first thing I noticed wasn't what was inside it. It was what she hadn't brought, and what that absence told me about exactly how far their information actually went. Meredith had a way of preparing for conversations the way some people prepare for court. I had noticed that about her over the years. She didn't walk into difficult situations unprepared. She researched. She organized. She arrived with documentation, with talking points, with a clear idea of how the conversation was supposed to go, and a secondary plan for when it didn't. So when she opened that folder and I saw what was inside it, I recognized immediately that she had done her homework. What I also recognized, and this is the part that told me everything I needed to know in the first 30 seconds, was that her homework had a very specific ending point. She had researched up to a certain date, and that date was several weeks before the morning she was sitting across from me. The folder contained printed documents, property tax records, a summary sheet from what looked like a title company. I recognized the format immediately from 31 years of professional experience. There were some handwritten notes on a yellow legal pad, clipped to the inside cover, and a printed email exchange that she had partially highlighted in yellow marker. She placed her hand flat on top of the documents the way people do when they want you to understand that what they're presenting is final. She said, Walter, I know this is difficult, but Daniel and I have looked at this carefully, and we think it's the right time to talk about transitioning the house. I looked at Daniel. He was standing near the window, not sitting. Standing, which I noticed because it was the posture of a man who wanted to be able to leave a room quickly. He said, "Dad, we've been thinking about this for a while. The house is a lot to maintain, and there are options that would make more sense for everyone. Options that would make more sense for everyone." I turned that sentence over in my mind the way you turn a stone over to see what's living underneath it. I asked them both if they wanted coffee. Meredith blinked. That was not the response she had prepared for. I got up, filled the kettle, set it on the burner, and stood with my back to them for a moment longer than was necessary. Not because I was composing myself. I was already composed. I was giving them time to feel the silence because, in my experience, silence makes people fill space with information they hadn't planned to share. Meredith said, "Walter, I don't think you're understanding what we're saying." I turned around and looked at her. I said, "I understand exactly what you're saying, Meredith. I'm making coffee." Daniel shifted his weight near the window. I brought 3 mugs to the table, sat back down, and asked her one question. The same question I had been waiting to ask since I watched them pull into my driveway. I said, "Who told you that I had to leave?" She didn't hesitate. That told me she'd prepared for this question specifically. She said, "A name. A man I didn't know personally, but whose professional title I recognized immediately. He was a real estate attorney based in Boston, where Daniel and Meredith lived." She explained that they had consulted him several months ago about the property's future, and that, based on his review of certain public records and documents Daniel had shared with him, he had concluded that the path forward was clear. I nodded slowly. I did not tell her what I was actually thinking in that moment. What I was thinking was that a Boston real estate attorney reviewing public records and documents Daniel had shared would have seen a specific and accurate picture of the property situation, as it had existed at the point those documents were produced. He would not have seen what Patricia Lund and I had signed 3 weeks ago, because that hadn't been filed yet when Meredith's attorney friend did his review. It had been filed 6 days ago. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and let her continue. She told me that they weren't asking me to leave permanently without support. She used phrases like transition plan and appropriate living situation and long-term well-being, which are the kinds of phrases that sound considerate on the surface and feel like a closed door when you're on the receiving end of them. She said they had already looked at a few places. Retirement communities, she called them, though the way she said it made clear she had a specific type of place in mind, and that one of them was only about 40 minutes from Portland, which she described as close enough to stay connected. Connected. As if I were a device that needed to remain within range of a signal. Daniel spoke up at that point, still from his position near the window. He said that the house was more than I could reasonably manage alone, that the maintenance costs were going to increase as the property aged, and that it made more financial sense to liquidate the asset, while the market was favorable rather than wait until circumstances forced the decision. Liquidate the asset. That was my home he was describing. The home where he had learned to drive in the driveway, where he had spent holidays with his mother, where I had repainted the spare bedroom 3 times over the years, because Elaine kept changing her mind about the color, and I never once complained about it, because watching her stand in the doorway, deciding whether she liked it, was one of my favorite things in the world. Liquidate the asset. I kept my face still. I've had decades of practice keeping my face still while other people tell me things that require a measured response rather than an immediate one. I said, "You mentioned Daniel shared documents with your attorney. Which documents specifically?" Meredith glanced at Daniel. Daniel said, "The trust documents, Dad. The ones from when you set up the arrangement after Mom passed." I nodded again. I said, "And when did you get copies of those?" There was a pause. A short one, but I caught it. Daniel said, "I've had them for a while. You gave them to me." That was not entirely accurate. What I had done 4 years ago, when Patricia helped me establish the living trust, was mention to Daniel that the arrangement existed and that he should know the property had a structured plan. I had told him the general nature of it. I had not given him copies of the documents themselves. What he had, and I was now quite certain about this, were copies he had obtained some other way, possibly through the title records, possibly through someone who had access to the recording office, possibly through means I didn't need to investigate further because it didn't ultimately change what mattered. What mattered was what those documents said at the time he obtained them. And what they said at that time was a different story than what they said now. I did not explain any of this. At the kitchen table, I let Meredith turn another page in her folder and explain that they had spoken with a property management consultant, another person I didn't know, who had assessed the house and given them an approximate market valuation. She slid a single sheet across the table toward me with a number printed at the bottom. It was a reasonable number, not far off from what I would have estimated myself. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked up at her, and I asked the question that I knew she wasn't ready for. I said, "Meredith, has your attorney in Boston reviewed the complete current state of the trust, or just the version of the documents Daniel provided him?" The room got very quiet. She said, "What do you mean the current state?" I said, "Trusts can be amended. That's part of how they work. The version Daniel has may not reflect the most recent arrangement." She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at me. He said, "Dad, what did you do?" I said, "I had coffee with my attorney. Same as you did." Now, I want to stop here for a moment because I know how this part of the story might sound. It might sound like I was enjoying it, like I was sitting across from my son and his wife with some kind of satisfaction, watching their certainty start to develop small cracks around the edges. But that's not what I was feeling. What I was feeling was something much quieter and much harder to describe. It was the feeling of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the person who made sure things were handled. The bills, the maintenance, the legal arrangements, the forward planning, sitting in his own kitchen and realizing that the people who should have trusted his competence the most had instead decided, without asking him a single question, that he no longer had the capacity to manage his own affairs. That was the thing that sat in my chest that morning. Not anger, not triumph, just a deep and very specific kind of tiredness that comes from understanding that someone you love has looked at you and seen something smaller than you are. Meredith closed the folder. She said, "Walter, if you've made changes to the trust, we should probably have our attorney review them before we go any further." I said, "That sounds reasonable." She said, "Can you tell us what you changed?" I said, "I can tell you that everything is properly documented and filed, and that Patricia Lund's office can answer any specific legal questions you have." Daniel pushed off from the window and sat down at the table for the first time since they'd arrived. He sat across from me, and for a moment he looked less like a 46-year-old man who had come to deliver a decision and more like the person I remembered from years ago, when he used to sit at that same table and work through problems he hadn't figured out yet. He said, "Dad, are you actually okay? Because I need to know if this is about the house or if there's something else going on with you." And there it was, the question that revealed the entire shape of what he believed. He thought my legal preparation was a symptom, a sign of confusion or stubbornness or an old man refusing to accept reality. He had reframed my competence as a problem that needed to be managed. And he had done it so thoroughly that even sitting across from me, even hearing that I had been working with my own attorney, his first instinct was to ask if I was okay, rather than to ask if he had made a mistake. I looked at my son for a long moment. I said, "I'm fine, Daniel. I've been fine. The question worth asking right now isn't whether I'm okay. It's whether you have the complete picture of what you're dealing with." He didn't answer that. Meredith picked her folder back up and set it in her lap. The conversation shifted after that, became more careful, more measured, the way conversations do when someone realizes they may have walked into a room without knowing its full dimensions. She asked a few more questions, all of which I answered honestly but without elaboration. Daniel sat quietly, which was its own kind of answer to something I hadn't asked out loud. They stayed for about another 40 minutes. When they left, Meredith shook my hand at the door, which struck me as an odd thing to do. Daniel hugged me briefly and said he'd call later. I told him that was fine. I stood in the doorway and watched them back out of the driveway and disappear down Willowmere Lane. Then I went back inside, washed the 3 coffee mugs, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the old oak in the backyard. The leaves were mostly gone by then. Late October in Maine will do that. But the tree itself was solid, the trunk unchanged, the roots holding the way they always had, invisible underground, doing the work quietly while everything above the surface changed with the season. I thought that was a reasonably accurate description of what I had spent the last several months doing, and I also knew that the morning had not resolved anything. What it had done was begin something. Meredith was not a person who absorbed unexpected information and quietly adjusted her plans. She was a person who gathered more information and came back better prepared. I knew that about her. I had known it for 18 years. She was going to call her attorney in Boston. Her attorney was going to request the updated trust documents from the county recording office. And when he read what Patricia Lund and I had signed 3 weeks ago, he was going to have a conversation with Meredith and Daniel that would change the temperature of this situation considerably. I had approximately 5 to 7 business days before that happened. What I did with those days mattered. Not because I needed to prepare defenses or build legal arguments. All of that was already done, properly and completely. What mattered was what I decided about my own position, about how I wanted to carry myself through whatever came next, about what kind of relationship with my son I was willing to accept or not accept after everything that had already been said and not said. Because here's the thing about that morning that I have thought about more than any other part of this story. Meredith had come prepared with documents, valuations, transition plans, and a Boston attorney's review. She had a folder. She had talking points. She had her version of events neatly organized and ready to present. But she had made one assumption that ran underneath all of it like a structural flaw in a foundation, the kind of thing that doesn't show on the surface until enough weight is applied. She had assumed that I had not been paying attention. In 31 years as a surveyor, I had made a professional practice out of paying attention to exactly the things other people overlooked. Property lines that shifted over decades. Documents that described one reality while the land told a different story. The gap between what people believed they owned and what they could actually demonstrate on paper. I had been paying attention for 14 months. I had been paying attention while Daniel asked careful questions over pot roast. While a man with a clipboard walked my property line on a Saturday. While a piece of mail from a title company arrived at my address. While Ray Dobbins mentioned a strange conversation at the garage. I had been paying attention, and I had acted on what I observed, and now the folder on my kitchen table was about 6 weeks behind the actual situation. That gap between what Meredith believed and what was now legally true was not something I had created to punish her. I had created it because it was the responsible thing to do with a house I had spent 30 years building into something that meant more than money. I had created it because Patricia Lund was right when she told me 4 years ago after Elaine passed that clarity established in calm moments protects everyone from the damage that gets done in difficult ones. The irony was that the very protection I had put in place to prevent this kind of conflict was now the thing standing between Meredith's plan and its execution. I didn't find that satisfying. I found it sad in a way that was harder to sit with than anger would have been, because anger passes. You feel it, and it moves through you, and eventually the space it occupied becomes something else. What I was feeling wasn't anger. It was the particular weight of understanding that the people closest to you have built a version of you in their minds that doesn't match who you actually are, and that they've made significant decisions based on that version without ever stopping to check their work. In surveying, we call that an unverified assumption. An unverified assumption doesn't feel like a problem until you try to build something on top of it. Then the whole structure tells you the truth. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, sat back down at the kitchen table, and opened my pocket notebook to a clean page. Old habit. Whenever I had a situation I needed to think through clearly, I wrote down the facts in the order I knew them. Not interpretations, not feelings. Just the facts, sequenced, with dates where I had them. I wrote for about 20 minutes. When I was done, I looked at what was on the page and understood something that I think had been forming in the back of my mind since the morning I first called Patricia Lund. The next move didn't belong to me. It belonged to Meredith. She was going to make it within the next week. And it was going to tell me more about the actual intentions behind all of this than anything she had said at the kitchen table. All I had to do was wait. And if there is one thing a man learns after 7 decades of living, after 31 years of standing on cold ground with a transit level and a set of documents, verifying the truth of things, one careful measurement at a time, it is how to wait without losing himself in the waiting. I closed the notebook, I set it beside the brass compass on the shelf, and I decided that whatever Meredith did next, I was going to be ready for it in the same way I had been ready that morning. Not with anger, not with a rehearsed argument, but with a complete and accurate understanding of exactly where I stood. That was the one advantage in this situation that no folder could take away from me. If the story is hitting close to home, if you know what it feels like to be underestimated by the people who should know you best, you're not alone, and this channel exists for exactly that reason. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what happens next in Walter's story is the part that changes everything, and you don't want to come in halfway through. because Meredith did make her next move. She made it on a Thursday afternoon, 6 days after that kitchen table conversation. And when she made it, she did something that she was absolutely certain was her strongest play. Something she had clearly been planning even before she arrived at my door with that folder. What she didn't know was that, in doing it, she handed me something I hadn't expected to have. Not a legal advantage. Something more important than that. Thursday came the way late October days come in Maine. Gray and still, with the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself dramatically but simply settles into everything, the way water finds its level without making noise about it. I had spent the 6 days between Meredith's visit and that Thursday doing what I always did when something significant was unresolved. I kept to my routine. Morning coffee at the kitchen window. A walk down Willowmere Lane and back, about 1.5 miles, which I had done every morning for years, regardless of weather. Lunch at home. Afternoons reading or working in the small workshop I keep in the garage, where I restore old hand tools, planes, chisels, spoke shaves, not to sell them, but because working with my hands has always been the most reliable way I know to keep my thinking clear. Bev Colton waved at me from her porch on Tuesday morning. I waved back. She gave me a look that told me she had noticed Daniel's car in my driveway the previous week and had decided, with characteristic tact, not to ask about it directly. I appreciated that about her more than she probably knew. Daniel called on Wednesday evening, as he said he would. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. I know because I checked afterward, not out of anything strategic, just out of the habit of a man who has spent a lifetime noting details that might matter later. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine. He asked if I had spoken with Patricia Lund recently. I told him we were in contact. He said that he and Meredith had reached out to their attorney again, and that there were some questions about the trust documentation that needed clarification. I said that made sense, and that Patricia's office could address any specific questions they had. Then there was a pause. Not the kind of pause that happens when someone is thinking of what to say next. The kind that happens when someone has already decided what they want to say and is trying to find the version of it that sounds least like what it actually is. He said, "Dad, I want you to know that none of this is coming from a bad place." I said, "I know, Daniel." He said, "We just want to make sure you're protected." I said, "I know." And then, because I had been his father for 46 years and I understood the architecture of how he avoided direct confrontation, I let the silence sit there between us on the phone line until he filled it. He said, "Are you upset with me?" I thought about that question for a moment before answering, not because I didn't know the answer, but because the honest answer was more complicated than yes or no, and I respected him enough not to reduce it. I said, "I'm not upset with you, Daniel. I'm disappointed by a few specific things. But those are conversations for a different day. You said you'd call, and you called. That means something to me." He said good night. I said good night. I set the phone down and sat in the armchair by the window for a while, in the dark, not watching anything, just sitting with the weight of that conversation the way you sit with something that has a shape you're still figuring out. The call told me two things. The first was that Daniel was uncomfortable, not just with the situation, with himself. There's a difference in the quality of someone's discomfort when it comes from external pressure versus internal conflict, and what I heard in his voice on Wednesday evening was the second kind. The second thing was that Meredith was moving forward regardless. She had not told him to stand down. She had told him to call his father and check in, which is what you do when you want to maintain the appearance of family consideration while the actual decision-making proceeds on a parallel track. I understood the strategy. I didn't fault her for having one, but I recognized it clearly. And that recognition told me that Thursday was going to be significant. I was right about that. At 2:17 in the afternoon on Thursday, I received a phone call from Patricia Lund. She didn't call often outside of scheduled appointments, so I knew before I answered that something had developed. She told me that her office had received a formal request from a Boston-based attorney named Gerald Stanhope, representing Daniel and Meredith Hargrove, requesting access to the complete current documentation of the Hargrove Living Trust, including any amendments filed within the preceding 90 days. Patricia said, "He was professional, very thorough. But I could tell from the specific language he used that he already knew something had changed. He wasn't fishing, Walter. He was confirming." I asked her what she had told him. She said she had informed him that the trust documentation was a matter of record at the county recording office. and that his client was welcome to obtain copies through the standard process, and that any questions regarding the trust's administration or the trustees' decisions should be directed to her in writing. I said, "Good." She said, "Walter, when Stanhope gets those documents and reads through the amendment, his clients are going to have a significant recalibration to do. I want to make sure you've thought through how you want to handle the conversation that follows, because it's going to happen, and it's going to be emotional." I told her I had thought about it. She said, "I know you have. I just want to say something as your attorney and also as someone who has worked with you for 4 years. What you did with this trust, both the original arrangement and the amendment, was done correctly, responsibly, and completely within your rights. No one can characterize it as reactive or retaliatory because the documentation trail is clear. You were doing estate planning. That's what people do." I thanked her. She said, "The only thing I want you to remember is that the moment they read that amendment, the conversation stops being about the house and starts being about the family. And that part I can't help you with." I told her I knew. She said, "Are you ready for that?" I thought about the old oak in the backyard and the wallpaper in the kitchen and the brass compass on the shelf. I said, "Patricia, I've been ready for that since Wednesday evening." She said she'd be in touch. I set the phone down, and then I did something I hadn't done in months. I went upstairs to the spare bedroom, the one Elaine had repainted 3 times, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I let myself feel the full weight of what was happening without managing it or processing it or converting it into action items. I just sat with it. The spare bedroom still had Elaine's final color on the walls, a pale blue-gray that she had eventually decided was exactly right. I had never changed it, not out of grief, though grief was part of it, out of the simple fact that she had been correct. It was exactly right. And there was no reason to alter something that someone you loved had gotten exactly right. I sat in that room for about 20 minutes. Then I went back downstairs, put on my coat, and took my afternoon walk. The call from Patricia that had confirmed Meredith's attorney was requesting the documents. That was the moment I understood that Meredith had made her move. And it was the move I had expected. But what I hadn't expected, and this is the part of the story that I have turned over in my mind more than any other, because it surprised me in a way that very few things at my age still managed to do, was what arrived in my mailbox on Friday morning. Not a legal document, not a letter from Gerald Stanhope's office, a handwritten note from Daniel. Not an email, not a text message. A handwritten note on plain paper in the particular careful handwriting he had developed as an adult that looked nothing like the handwriting he had as a younger man, which had always been slightly chaotic in the way that suits someone still figuring out who they are. This handwriting was measured, deliberate. The handwriting of a man who had sat down knowing exactly what he wanted to say and taking the time to say it by hand rather than by keyboard, because some things require the physical commitment of putting pen to paper to feel honest. It wasn't long. He wrote that he had been thinking since Wednesday night. He wrote that he understood for the first time that there was a significant difference between assuming he knew what was best for someone and actually knowing. He wrote that he had let Meredith take the lead on this because he had told himself it was the practical thing to do, but that sitting in my kitchen last Tuesday and watching me make coffee while his wife told me to leave my own home, he had felt something he hadn't been able to name until he was alone. He named it in the letter. He said it felt like shame. He said he didn't know yet what that meant for what came next. But he needed me to know that it existed because he was not willing to let it stay unnamed between us. He signed it with just his name, no closing pleasantry, just Daniel. I read that note 3 times at the kitchen table. Then I folded it carefully and placed it inside the wooden box with the property documents, not as evidence, not as protection, as something worth keeping. Because in 46 years of being that man's father, that note was the most honest thing he had ever committed to paper, and I understood what it cost him to write it, because I raised him, and I know that he is not naturally a person who names uncomfortable things. He is a person who manages them, organizes them, delegates them to someone more willing to speak directly. Writing that note was an act of character, and it changed the weight of everything that came next. Gerald Stanhope received the trust documents from the county recording office on the following Monday. Patricia told me he called her that same afternoon. She said the conversation was brief and professional. He had reviewed the amendment. He understood its implications. He told her he needed to speak with his clients before any further communication occurred, and she said that was completely appropriate. She also told me, And this she offered with a particular dryness that I had come to appreciate about her over the years, that Stanhope had asked once whether the amendment had been filed in response to recent family discussions, and that she had informed him, accurately and without elaboration, that the amendment had been in preparation for several weeks prior to any family discussion and had been filed through the standard process with no urgency applied. In other words, I had not reacted to Meredith's visit. I had simply completed something that was already underway. That distinction mattered legally, and it mattered in a deeper way that had nothing to do with law. It meant that everything I had done came from a place of responsibility rather than retaliation. And it meant that when Meredith finally understood the full picture, she could not honestly characterize what had happened as a counterattack. She could only characterize it as the consequence of acting before verifying the complete truth. The conversation I had been waiting for happened on a Saturday, 11 days after Meredith had arrived with her folder. They drove up together from Boston. Daniel called ahead this time, which I noticed and appreciated. They arrived at 10 in the morning. I had made a full pot of coffee, and there was a coffee cake from the bakery on Elm Street that I had always liked. And I set it on the table because whatever was about to happen, it was going to happen between people who had known each other for a long time, and that deserved something more than an empty table. Meredith looked different than she had the previous Tuesday. Not diminished, that's not the word. More considered. The careful organization she always carried with her was still present, but it was quieter, the way a prepared person looks when they've discovered that preparation wasn't quite enough and they're recalibrating in real time. She sat down. She did not bring the folder this time. Daniel sat beside her. He looked at me when he came in with an expression I recognized from years ago, the look of someone who has already said something important and isn't sure yet how it was received. I gave him the smallest nod. He let out a breath. Meredith said, "Walter, I want to start by saying that we've spoken with Gerald and we've reviewed the amended trust documents, and I want to understand from you directly what your intentions are." I said, "That's a fair question. I'll answer it. But first I'd like to say something." She nodded. I took a moment, not for effect, but because what I had to say had been forming for 11 days, and I wanted to say it correctly, without excess, without performance. I said, "Meredith, I don't have any interest in making this harder than it has to be. You came to this house 11 days ago with information you believed was complete, and you made a decision based on that information. I understand how that happened. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it didn't affect me, because it did. But what affected me more than the decision itself was realizing that nobody in this room, before that Tuesday morning, had ever sat across from me and asked me what I actually wanted." She was quiet. I continued. I said, "I have lived in this house for nearly 30 years. I maintained it. I paid for it. I buried my wife and came back to it and kept it standing. I am 71 years old, and I am in good health, and I am in complete command of my decisions. And somewhere along the way, you and Daniel built a version of me in your minds that was already past that point, a version that needed to be managed, and you built your plans around that version without checking whether it matched the actual person sitting across from you." Daniel said, "Dad." I looked at him. I said, "I know you wrote me that note, Daniel. I know what it cost you. And I want you to know that I read it, and I kept it, and it changed something for me. But I need you to hear this too, because if we don't say it out loud, it's going to sit between us for years." He said, "Okay." I said, "The moment that hurt me most in all of this, not the folder, not the attorney, not the plans you made without asking me, was that Tuesday morning in this kitchen when Meredith told me to leave my own home, and you stood by that window and said nothing. Not one question. Not one moment of doubt. You let it happen. And that told me something about how you see me now that I have been trying to make sense of ever since." The room was completely silent. Daniel looked at the table. When he looked up, his eyes were red, in the way men's eyes get red when they're holding something in that deserves to come out. He said, I know I did that, and I don't have a version of that I'm proud of." Meredith said nothing, but something in her posture shifted. A small, almost invisible settling, the kind that happens when a person stops defending a position and begins, privately, to revise it. I poured coffee for all three of us. Then I told them what the amendment to the trust actually said. What I had done, with Patricia's guidance 3 weeks before Meredith's visit, was formalize a decision I had been considering for 2 years. The amendment established a charitable remainder arrangement for a portion of the property's eventual value, directed toward the Portland Public Library System, an institution I had used my entire adult life and believed in deeply. It also clarified, with absolute legal precision, that the trustee of the property during my lifetime was myself, and that no decisions regarding the property's disposition could be made, initiated, or legally pursued by any other party without my explicit written consent while I remained alive and competent. It was not a weapon. It was a lock on a door that should have been locked from the beginning. Meredith listened to all of this without interrupting, which was itself something. When I finished, she said, "The charitable component, that wasn't reactive. You've been planning that." It wasn't quite a question. I said, "For about 2 years. I believe in leaving things better than you found them. That's true of land, and it's true of institutions." She nodded slowly. She said, "Walter, I owe you an apology." I said, "I'm listening." She said, "I came here 11 days ago, certain that I understood the situation completely. I had done research, and I had legal advice, and I had convinced myself that I was being practical and responsible. And somewhere in all of that, I stopped asking whether you had your own perspective on your own life, which was..." She paused. "That was wrong. I handled it wrong." It was a careful apology. Meredith was constitutionally incapable of an unstructured one. But it was genuine, and I had been around long enough to know the difference between a genuine apology that arrives in organized sentences and a performed one that arrives in tears, and hers was the former. I told her I appreciated it. I told her that I did not need us to spend the rest of the morning dissecting everything that had gone wrong, because I was more interested in what came next than in reconstructing every mistake that had been made. Daniel said, "What does come next, Dad?" "For you, for the house. What do you actually want?" And there it was, the question that should have been the first one asked 11 days ago, before the folder appeared on my kitchen table. What did I want? I want to tell you something about that question because I think it matters beyond this particular story and this particular kitchen and these particular people. When you spend decades being the person who handles things, who makes the payments, fixes the porch, files the paperwork, plans for the future, manages the arrangements, there comes a point where the people around you stop asking what you want and start assuming that what you want is whatever continuation of the current situation requires the least disruption to everyone else. They stop seeing your preferences and start seeing your function. And the cruelest part of it is that it usually isn't malicious. It's just what happens when people get comfortable. They get comfortable with you being competent and steady and always managed, and they forget that competence and steadiness don't mean you've stopped having desires or fears or a clear and considered vision for your own remaining years. I had one. I had had one for a long time. I told them I intended to remain at 418 Willowmere Lane for as long as I was able and willing to do so. I intended to maintain it myself, with help where I chose to bring it in, on my terms and my timeline. I intended to honor the charitable arrangement I had made because I believed it was right, and I would not be revisiting that decision. And I intended, going forward, to have a relationship with both of them that was based on the actual person I was, rather than the diminished version they had apparently been planning around. That was what I wanted. Daniel said, "That's fair." Meredith said, "We can do that." I believed her, not because the conversation had resolved everything. It hadn't. There were going to be awkward months ahead, careful conversations, the slow process of rebuilding something that had developed cracks that don't disappear just because everyone agrees to see them. But the foundation was still there. And foundations, in my experience, are worth working to preserve. They left around 1 in the afternoon. Daniel hugged me at the door longer than he had in years. Meredith shook my hand, and then, unexpectedly, put her other hand over mine for a moment before letting go. I stood in the doorway and watched them drive away down Willowmere Lane. Then I went back inside, washed the coffee mugs, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the old oak in the backyard. The last of the leaves were gone. The branches were bare against the gray October sky, completely exposed, nothing hidden. But the tree looked exactly as solid as it always had. Maybe more so, because without the leaves you could see the actual structure of it. The way the limbs had grown over decades, each one finding its direction, the whole thing balanced by years of slow and deliberate reaching. I thought about what Patricia had said, that she couldn't help me with the family part. She was right about that. But here is what I have come to understand in the months since that Saturday morning. The thing I find myself returning to whenever I think about why I tell this story at all. What Walter Hargrove discovered in those weeks was not a legal advantage. It was the answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking. The question of how much of yourself you are willing to quietly give away in the name of keeping the peace. How many times you will accept being managed before you decide to simply demonstrate, calmly and completely, that you were never the person being managed in someone else's story. You were always the main character in your own. I kept the note Daniel wrote. I kept the brass compass and the handwritten surveyor's notebook and the framed photograph from the first years in the house. I stayed at 418 Willowmere Lane, not because I won something, because after nearly 30 years of building something worth keeping, I finally stopped confusing love with surrender and understood that the most powerful thing a man can do is simply refuse to disappear before it's time. And I'll tell you this much, friend. I'm still here. Still making coffee at that kitchen window every morning. Still walking Willowmere Lane and back. Still keeping the house the way it deserves to be kept. And I wouldn't change a single quiet, careful, deliberate thing about how it all went. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever felt underestimated by the people who should know you best, or if you know someone who has, leave a comment below and tell me about it. I read every single one, and you'd be surprised how much it means to know that a story like Walter's lands somewhere real. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Because the stories on this channel are just getting started, and every single one of them is worth staying for.